Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Alternative Network Visibility Strategies for an Encrypted World, sponsored by Corelight. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and today's featured speakers are Gregory Bell, CEO of Corelight, and Matt Bromley, SANS Certified Digital Forensics and Incident Response Instructor. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to John Gamble of Corelight, who will be moderating today's webcast.
Thanks so much, Carol. One last bit I'll add to Carol's great introduction is questions. So if you have questions at any point during today's webcast, feel free to use your panel and enter a question, type that in. We'll be able to see it. We're going to save Q&A till the end, and provided we have time, we'll get to your question, and if not, we'll try to follow up with you afterwards. So without further ado, let's get started, and I'm going to introduce today's great speakers. So sitting to my right here in Corelight headquarters is Gregory Bell, CEO of Corelight. Greg has held leadership roles at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, including as Director of the Scientific Networking Division and Director of the U.S. Department of Energy's High Performance Mission Network, ESNet. And he was also Chief Technology Architect in the Office of the CIO. Greg has a PhD from UC Berkeley and an AB from Harvard. Also joining us today is Matt Bromley, SANS instructor extraordinaire and also a great expert on Zeek, which we'll be talking a lot about today. Matt, I believe, is joining us from the other side of the ocean in Europe at a conference today, and he is a SANS Digital Forensics and Incident Response Instructor and a GIAC Advisory Board member. And he's also a principal consultant at a major incident response and forensic analysis company and brings his experience together in digital forensics, incident response, triage, and log analytics. So I'll just give you a brief preview of today's agenda. We're going to be talking a bit about the encryption problem, which I think is a problem, all organizations, all SOCs are dealing with right now, which is, with the rising tide of encryption from a security perspective, what's the best next move there to get visibility and defensibility around that traffic. We'll be talking then about Zeek, which is an open source network security monitoring framework, and Greg will be diving into Zeek's capabilities around encrypted traffic visibility and analysis. And then we'll be looking at some use cases that Matt will go through in great detail that'll actually provide you specific examples of the data that Zeek generates around encrypted traffic and how you can use it to solve tactical problems in your organization. And then lastly, we'll try to save 5 to 10 minutes for questions and answers. And again, if you're just joining us, just tuning in the last 30 seconds, feel free to ask a question in your panel and we'll see it and we'll answer it at the end. So we're going to hold Q&A until the end. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg.
Great. Thank you, John. Thanks for the intro. And I would like to thank SANS for co-sponsoring today, and I'd especially like to thank Matt Bromley for lending his amazing technical insight. I'm really excited about the content he has prepared. Some of you may have taken courses or plan to take courses in the future from Matt. He's terrific. And of course, thanks for all of you who've shown up either in real time or after the fact. We're looking forward to a great discussion. I'll begin by saying I am, by training and sort of by instinct, a network engineer, network operator, and I learned early on in that career the value of the tool TCP dump for network operations, for security, for a whole variety of purposes, and that's because networks are just incredible sources of data and ground truth. Most attacks have to leave some trace on the network. It might be possible to imagine a few corner cases where that's not the case, but I think in general, most attacks leave some trace and often lots of different traces on the network. You can learn about, by analyzing network traffic, you can learn about files and apps and servers, databases, users, endpoints, patterns of behavior. There's an awful lot you can learn. In fact, I think if you are responsible for defending organizations, one of the most important things you can do is to monitor your networks. It gives you a comprehensive picture, it gives you ground truth. It's relatively simple to implement compared to other foundational security techniques, and it's non-disruptive. It doesn't interrupt traffic. Passive network security monitoring doesn't, and it gives you a foundation of data for all kinds of activities, for operations, incident response, threat hunting, forensics, and more. Over to you, Matt.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Greg. And thank you for that introduction. And thanks everyone who's joining us on behalf of the whole team here. We're super excited to have you. One of the things that I agree wholeheartedly with Greg on is the ability and that insight that you get into your network. But unfortunately, and especially as an incident responder, we're starting to see that visibility be a little bit harder to obtain, for lack of a better term. And that's primarily due to the rise in encryption traffic that we're seeing. We're going to obviously go through some use cases a little bit later on, but before we do, it's important to understand really just how prevalent this particular, and I don't want to say problem. It's not a problem. It's not an epidemic. It's actually a good thing. It's good that we're moving towards encryption, but it means we have to adjust some of our analysis techniques and some of our analysis cycles in the way that we approach data. And a report from Zscaler about this time last year, they recognized somewhere in the vicinity of about 800,000 SSL threats blocked per day. Granted, in the overall scope of the internet, that's maybe just a drop in the bucket, but for an organization that's trying to combat these threats and is just trying to get its hand on some basic protocol awareness, that obviously introduces a significant problem. Furthermore, Fortinet's Q3 report last year, I should say, brought out 72% of all network traffic now being encrypted based on their visibility. And then, of course, Google's transparency report, which is always a really good bellwether of the state of encryption and whatnot throughout the course of internet traffic. They're seeing 89% of web pages loaded in the United States using HTTPS. The real big takeaway for everyone here is as you go through and think about your visibility, your ability to analyze, parse, and gain data from your network traffic is just how much is encryption impacting you. Because at the high visibility levels, at the Googles and at the Fortinets and Zscalers, it's a significant number. It's very, very high double-digit percentages. So I think this is going to help kind of, talk about the course that we're going to take inside of this webcast today, which is how do we deal with this from an organizational perspective? Back to you, Greg.
Sure, great. And a little supplement to those patterns, Matt identified TLS 1.3 does complicate the picture. And this isn't a webinar about TLS. You can learn about it, read about it. You can join the IETF mailing list if you'd like. It's an evolution of the TLS protocol that offers significant technical benefits. It's more secure, more performant, and it offers at the same time operational challenges. It reduces the amount of observable TLS data. It makes it difficult or in some cases impossible to break and inspect. Some would consider that a bug and others a feature. And again, it's not a webinar on that topic, but this is just a fact in the ongoing evolution of the internet that TLS is evolving and the prevalence of 1.3 is rising. And I will say, we're not going to make this a policy webinar, but I want to be front and center with this point. Decryption is not always the right solution. It's not always technically feasible. It's not always legal. It's not always consistent with the policy framework that you work within, or it's not always ethical. And I think for the rest of our careers, there is going to be a tension and an appropriate tension between the requirements of privacy on the one hand and the requirements of defensibility on the other hand. And both are important ideals. It's not the only sphere in which two competing ideals play out, and there's a pendulum swing between the two. I just think we're seeing this more and more in our professional lives, and it's going to characterize our lives for the rest of our careers. Sometimes it might be possible to access unencrypted traffic streams, and sometimes it won't be. What we thought we'd do with this webinar is focus on the hardest case when it's not possible to access an unencrypted traffic stream, just to make things hard for Matt, actually. And I think it's maybe the most interesting and difficult architecture. So we thought we'd focus on it and zoom in a little bit into that case here. Now, you might wonder, thank you for advancing. You might wonder if it's time just to throw in the towel and give up on network security monitoring. And in fact, my colleague at Corelight, Richard Baitlick, wrote a blog post sort of with a headline that suggested that in a very tongue-in-cheek way. It's a great blog post. You can Google for it. And his answer, of course, is no. It's my answer, too. I will offer, the rest of this webinar is the beginning, sort of the down payment of some evidence supporting the answer no. But I will offer this metaphor. I didn't invent it, and I'm not sure who did. Oh, okay, my colleague John did. Thank you, John. It's great. But many of us as kids have received wrapped gifts at one time or another for birthdays or a special holiday. And if we weren't going to unwrap them in advance and appropriately, we would develop the sixth sense for trying to figure out what was inside them. You know, we'd shake them. We'd try to figure out if it was it a video game, a sweater? It's probably not a bicycle. What's the size? Does the thing inside rattle? And we'd actually learn quite a bit about the gift without actually breaking the wrapping paper. This webinar really is about how we can use exceptionally good network-derived data to shake the box. There's lots of techniques. You're going to learn about them. And that is a good transition to the tool that will be highlighted in this webinar. It's called Zeek. Zeek is an open source, a very powerful open source project originally created by Corelight's chief scientist and co-founder, Vern Paxson, when he was a grad student at UC Berkeley and working at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. It is, I think for most of, maybe half of its lifetime, it was known as a tricky thing to deploy, the ultimate power tool maybe, deployed mostly in governments, national labs, large universities. But in the last 5 or 6 years, it has become explosively popular. It's widely adopted and deployed all over the world in all kinds of environments. And I think it's accurate now to say it's really become the gold standard tool and data format for making sense of network traffic in real time. And if you take a class from SANS in incident response or threat hunting, or read a book on the topic, you're likely to learn about this tool. And I will note, it's recently, the open source community has changed the name of the tool. It used to be called Bro, it's now called Zeek. There's videos and blog posts that explain the rationale for that, so I won't linger on it, but you may, the syllable bro may sneak out of my mouth or Matt's or John's just because our brains have been wired that way for a long time. But we're all trying to say Zeek going forward. And just real briefly, what the tool does is it transforms traffic, network traffic, and all of its weirdness and complexity and high volume into a much smaller data stream, a series of real-time logs that compactly summarize what happened on the wire without much of an opinion, for the most part, about whether it's good or bad. There's a little footnote to that claim, but in general, the architectural insight of Zeek is that it's useful to have data that doesn't have an opinion in advance about what it's going to see on the wire. Zeek can also extract files right from protocols it understands and write them to disk, and that can be very important and interesting forensically. And in addition to everything I described, it's a pretty cool application platform. So you can learn to write scripts and packages that live on top of the Zeek platform and that do even more interesting work. It's very well suited for making correlations across hundreds or thousands or millions of flows. Very well suited for behavioral detections, and there's an evolving ecosystem of these packages in the public domain. I think Matt's going to talk about at least one of them, but it's something you can learn to do and you can probably have fun doing, and that's one of the great things about this project. So there are 4 major capabilities. This is not going to be a deep overview on Zeek, but there are 4 major capabilities I'll touch on briefly as an introduction to Matt's really deep dive into some of the Zeek logs. First of all, Zeek has this cool feature, I think underappreciated, called dynamic protocol detection. And that means that the project is a little bit suspicious. So if it sees a TCP stream on port 80, it's not going to just naively assume that's HTTP traffic or web traffic. What it does under the hoods is attach all of its many protocol parsers to every stream and just go ahead and try to use all of them, parse that stream until they all fail but one. And this is computationally intensive, it's difficult, it's really neat. And it means that Zeek can reliably detect protocols, whatever port that they're using. And in the case of encrypted traffic, because it parses the most commonly used encryption protocols, it'll find them on whatever port they happen to be lurking on. So it's going to find that interesting TLS connection to your television that you may not be expecting. It's on a non-standard port. It may find that a traffic stream that you expect to be encrypted is not encrypted, etc. There's a gold mine of data you can get from this particular feature. It also deeply, reliably, thoroughly parses most common network protocols, and the number of protocols that it parses will grow over time. This is a community project. If you're interested in Zeek parsing a protocol that's relevant to you that doesn't already parse, you can learn to write a protocol parser. And in fact, that process is going to get easier this year because the open source community is completely revamping the architecture for the parsing engine of Zeek. But in its current state, it parses dozens of protocols. It summarizes them neatly. In the case of these encryption relevant protocols, it extracts tons of relevant fields that Matt will exploit in his analysis. But you can look for weak ciphers, expired certs, self-signed certs, patterns of cert reuse that might be correlated with malicious activity. You can look at the length and the timing of connections and correlations between connections and the relationship to DNS. You can look at producer-consumer ratios and lots more. And you can build apps that do that automatically. So this is rich data, relevant, actionable data. It's cool stuff. It also correlates automatically. It's rich multiple data sources. So this is a hugely popular feature. And the best example is probably the unique ID field. I will not give a Zeek tutorial here, but I'll just say that Zeek remembers a unique ID for every connection, and wherever it's possible to stamp that unique ID on related logs, HTTP, files logs, SSL logs, it does that to make it easier for you, the analyst, to pivot quickly between the various data fields in your SIM, or make it easier for your analytics pipeline to get to the truth quicker. And in general, it makes analyst jobs more fun, and it helps you tell the story of what happened on the wire more quickly and more efficiently, and it's part of the magic of the project. I think Matt's going to show you some of this, and also I will say Richard Baitlick demonstrated the power of this pivotability of the data in a great recent blog post. It's called Examining Aspects of Encrypted Traffic Through Zeek Logs. Let me just repeat that, Examining Aspects of Encrypted Traffic Through Zeek Logs. Google it. I think it came out last week. It's full of screenshots, and it's just another version of the kind of analysis Matt's going to do for us. And I think I'm just about done. We'll pass the baton over to Matt for the really technical content. But I will say that the automation of insights and the scriptability of Zeek is just super cool. I alluded to it a bit earlier. It is an application platform. You can program it, extend it, and make it better. And this slide highlights the JA3 script contributed by good members, great friends, and good members of the Zeek community from Salesforce. I think most of them still at Salesforce. It's possible not all are anymore. But Salesforce open sourced the script. Now there's a series, I think there's at least 2 more similar scripts. And what this script does is fingerprint SSL client connections. And it exploits the fact that attackers often reuse malicious certs. And I don't think it's terribly complicated. I think you could probably, if you're learning the Zeek programming language, read it and learn something about the logic of the script pretty readily. It's a good place to start. It's only one of about 100 scripts that have been shared in public, and that number will certainly grow. So this is a great feature of the community and something that certainly gets me excited. I am going to now pass the baton over to Matt for the more technical part of the webinar.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. Appreciate that. And thanks, everyone. Again, I hope, and I really, really hope that those of you watching this here, if this is the very first time that you're hearing about Zeek, aka Bro, as Greg alluded to, and full disclosure, I'm right there with you, Greg. You might hear me accidentally say Bro as well, although I'm trying really, really hard to make sure I say the right name. You will sometimes, hear some of us who have kind of been using it for years make that accidental mistake, but we're working on fixing it. But no, those of you watching here, if this is the first time you're hearing about Zeek, but you find yourself in a very, very common situation of needing to analyze and make sense out of network traffic, I'm hoping you've got a couple browser windows open and you're kind of pivoting through some of the things that we've got there. If that's the case, I've got some interesting analysis oversights here. We've got about 4 use cases that we want to walk through here that give you some descriptions and really some technical insight into how you can use some of the Zeek data to your advantage. And from a very, very honest perspective here, there's been lots of periods of time where I've worked with various companies, and I've always kind of made I've always asked the question out, which is, are you monitoring port 443? Now, those of you who just cringed a little bit when I said that, I'm glad you did, because as we all know, that is a very, very, very simple question that I'm trying to get a very complex answer out of. And what I'm really looking for is how the organization is approaching network traffic and how they're dealing with potential encryption. Obviously, we know that port 443 is not guaranteed encryption, it's just the most common one. But to the point that Greg made a little bit earlier, which I wanted to make sure I highlighted before I started walking through use cases, one thing that you're going to notice as we walk through all these use cases here, I'm not really going to talk about port numbers as we go through this, because with all due respect, they don't really matter in this situation. As Greg was talking about here, Bro does not take a port-centric approach. Bro analyzes traffic as it comes through the wire. And if there's something that doesn't appear to fit in the right box, then Zeek will, see, there we go. I told you I'd say Bro at least once. Zeek will make sure to correctly categorize and detect it. We'll also get an indication that something is potentially off. So as we walk through these use cases here, we're going to hop over just to our next slide here really quick. I want you to notice that, again, I'm leaving ports out of this. And we're going to use that to our advantage as we work through these particular data sets here, because what I'm doing is I am losing the frame of mind of, oh, I must analyze everything over a certain port. What I'm doing instead is I'm keeping the theory of I am trying to analyze traffic regardless of how my attacker is sending it, because that's really what I'm looking for in this case, is detecting malicious traffic, and I can't put those blinders on. Now, as I go through these use cases, everyone who's watching here, you are going to hear me say the word tap every now and then. That's just to give John, who's controlling our screen, a chance to advance through some of the various animations analytically. So anything I say tap related is not related to any data. You're just going to hear me kind of drop it in there subtly. Now, in walking and watching through here, I wanted to first point out what was really referred to as, I'm going to call the old way of doing analysis. Now, there are a ton of different approaches that you can take towards these various Zeek logs. But in this case right here, I've taken what is known as the Zeek files log. And the files log, which I've truncated in this case, but you'll notice has a lot of useful information about it. Quick tap. And in here, I've got things such as timestamps, IPs. I've also got a MIME type for an executable, as well as a couple of hashes associated with that executable as well. And then, as you'll see in our next tap, which is going to bring up some various log details, there is, and then one more, John, just so we can bring this correlation into point here. You see that I can take some of these details and correlate between multiple different log sets. And the takeaway that I want you all to get from this old way of doing analysis, if you will, is it used to be really, really straightforward when everything was plain text. This is an older analysis technique. I can pivot through HTTP data. Zeek gives me PE logs, which actually examine portable executables that come down the wire. I also get the files log, which gives me that file ID, and also captures things such as the MD5 and the SHA-1, so on and so forth. So I used to have, in plain text traffic, a lot of rich data to search off of. Now, if anyone thinks that the cadence that I'm going through here says you're not going to get that in encrypted, in fact, it's completely the other way around. Let's go to the next slide and talk really quickly about just how this is going to be relevant for us. So first and foremost, as I said a little bit earlier on the slide, attackers are going to often encrypt their traffic to avoid detection. This is, once again, an attacker mindset of, if I make it so that it's tough for you to read, you likely won't be able to analyze it. They also make a couple of other assumptions here as well. Quick tap and you'll see their first thought is, who's watching it anyways, right? It's encrypted, no one's paying attention. The next thing that they'll do is, a quick tap later, they'll go ahead and say, if it's encrypted, the organization cannot see what I am doing. But, as you'll see in our next bullet here, there does remove a crucial evidence source for us. One of the key issues when an attacker does decide to go encrypted, for me, really exists in the lack or the seeming lack of visibility. But it's not a lack of visibility. In fact, it just means I have to change my analysis techniques and change the way I use and approach these particular data sets as well. And in fact, as you'll see as our next bullet comes up here, internet traffic is still traffic. Network traffic is still traffic. There's still metadata we can examine. And I like to sometimes use, I love the analogy that Greg gave a little bit earlier on about the present and what's inside of the box and shaking the box and figuring it out. One analogy that I use as well in some organizations that I talk to is I also say, think about a vehicle driving down the highway. And, you know, probably not going to be unfamiliar to anyone, but I can take a vehicle and I can go buy it off the lot and it has windows and I can see through those windows and I can see what's inside of the car. Or I can go and get a really heavy tint on those windows and make it really tough to see inside of the car. That doesn't change the fact that the car still had to drive in a direction. It turns left, it turns right, it goes from point A to point B, just because I take away the things that are inside. But more importantly, I can also wrap metadata around about that car as well. And as you're going to see in our next 2 bullet points here, so I'm going to see 2 taps from John, there are specific metadata points that I can pivot off of. The first one, which Greg just walked us through just a second here ago, is called the JA3 hash. And this is actually created by the folks over at Salesforce. For anyone looking for the history here, and this is fantastic for trivia night, the 3 individuals who I would say invented this hash, if you will, all had the initials of JA. So that's where we get that wonderful name from as well. We're going to talk a little bit about some various JA3 style hashes because there's more than just the one. The other super obvious metadata point, and of course this list is not conclusive at all, but the other obvious metadata point is also the concept of SSL certificates. Meaning, if I take a website that was once plain text and I wrap encryption around it, the odd thing is I actually leave an additional artifact as part of the traffic as well. And that additional artifact is now in the form of a certificate. And that's going to be our first pivot point. So let's go ahead and head over to our next analysis slide. So what I've done is I've taken us right back to the situation where we started out at, which was our files log. And our files log in this case is no longer displaying lovely information such as a application MS-DOS-X or a text file or anything else. Instead, the files log has become an encryption helper. And the files log has instead become the holder, if you will, of the SSL certs that have been downloaded as a result of this connectivity. Everyone, this is a fantastic analysis starting point. I will give you all a fair warning. A lot of the data logs that you're looking at here, I've actually truncated the fields down only because I would need a full slide to display every single data point that Zeek can extract for you. But whereas before, in our previous example, we were pulling file metadata and looking at file metadata and then comparing that to potentially find maliciousness of evil, guess what? There's metadata I can search off of in here as well. And as John's going to show us, and I think 3 taps from now, I can actually take those certificate pivot points, and then one more, sir. I can take those specific pivot points, and I can actually bump them up against certain blacklists that are out there. So believe it or not, just as we have hash repositories, just as we have various other data sources that allow you to perform lookups of things like hashes, domains, IP addresses, and everything in that arena, we also have the same types of databases for SSL related information. We will get to the JA3 databases in just a second. So I wanted to keep our first use case here. I wanted to start out with the files.log because it's the area, like I said, that we were just in where we started to have really good insight. Guess what? You didn't lose that insight. It's just a different type of file that we're going to be doing analysis on. Let's hop to the next slide. Let's expand this files.log into something with a little bit better approach here. One more tap, John, and we're going to see a correlation between these two. And what we've got in this particular situation is I'm taking that prevalent IP address that's inside of our files.log. Now, let me make one clarification for everyone. If you see and look at my screenshots here, you can see that I went through and I did some command line grepping and some command line analysis between these different log sets. Ladies and gentlemen, I actually did that intentionally because it's the slow way to do analysis using Zeek data. All of the connections that would have been established in the con log, which you can see in the bottom right-hand side, and the files.log, which you can see in the top-hand left, these actually have unique IDs that correlate between the two as well. So the thing that I wanted to show is even this robust analysis that I'm able to perform actually is being done in a slow manner also. So with that said, one more for us, John, and we're going to make a correlation here. Now, it may be a little tough to see in your screen, but what I wanted to point out is that to the right-hand side of the con log output, you can clearly see that the activity that we're looking at is SSL activity. There is a couple of reasons why I'm focusing on this point. Number one, it's confirmation that Zeek is detecting the type of traffic that I'm analyzing here. That's a great feature because it means that the tool is not just extracting certificates because they happen to appear. It is an awareness. It is a stateful awareness that the tool brings to your analysis. And that is an enormous, enormous advantage that you get when using a tool like this for these types of walkthroughs here. Let's look at the next slide because I want to continue to bridge a little bit of a gap here. If I then continue to click through, and let's go ahead and click through a couple more here, what I've done is I've now taken my con log. So we pivoted from my files log where I detected certificate data. I went to my con log where I confirmed that I was looking at SSL data, and we're now at the service specific, or I should say the flow specific SSL log. And in the SSL log, I've highlighted another column for you. And that particular column that we've highlighted is not actually any sort of certificate data. This is actually a representation of a JA3 hash. Now, there is a very, very lengthy write-up on a JA3 hash, but it is a feature and an add-on that we add into Zeek that allows us to actually generate a hash, a JA3 hash based off of this connectivity. Now, it's important to understand that a JA3 hash is not something that you can necessarily go and just dig out of sort of any set of data, if you will. It's actually a fingerprint that gets taken of the specific client hello packet. The JA3 hash takes a look at the SSL version, the cipher, the extension, the elliptic curve, and the curve point format. And with those values combined, and I feel like a Captain America announcement right here, but with those values combined, Captain Planet, sorry. With those values combined, it creates a 32-bit hash, as we can see, that gives us, 32-character hash, that gives us an analysis point that we can pivot off of. I have to pause here from an analysis point of view and tell you all what that gives you from an analytical point of view. We just took a series of encrypted communications. We confirmed via bro service identification, via protocol recognition, that we were looking at encrypted communications. And we took that JA3 algorithm and Zeek automatically applies it to all of our data as we push it through our various protocol analyzers. And it automatically generates that hash for us. This becomes useful on our next slide, because what I have now is I have a collection of JA3 hashes that are very, very unique to my encrypted traffic. If you notice, everyone, the only time I've ever said malware or malicious has been in the text at the top of the slide. I haven't found anything in the traffic yet that tells me it's malicious, because remember, it's encrypted. I can't go and inspect the traffic. But what I can do is I can take that JA3 hash and I can work and pivot off of it. And in this particular situation here, and I actually just did a really random Google search to see if I could find these hashes as being detected. And sure enough, we had two unique JA3 hashes for these particular IP connections that I was zooming in on. And they both happen to show up in some open source, open sense rules that are up on GitHub. Now, full disclosure, this is just a Google search and I went after the first result. The nice part about that first result is it gave me a couple different points of context. Number one, it gave me insight that I was dealing with some malicious traffic. But I don't know if anyone's picking up on the dots here. It is picking up on an alert that was written back in January 25th, 2018. Everyone, the traffic that we just examined was from actually about 3 days ago when it was generated. So let's think investigatively what I've got here. I've now got a pattern of encrypted client hello communication that is that has been turned into a hash that I can use for searching. But the crazy part about it is that pattern has not changed for a particular malware family over the past 14 months. So over the past 14 months, the encrypted traffic from that particular communication has looked the same. I've got a fingerprint, I've got an ability to track it down. I now have a brand new way to do analysis. I now have a brand new way to approach some of this encrypted data because I have that nice unique data point that I can pivot off of. So use case number one, looking for malware traffic, actually centers around grabbing those JA3 hashes and using them to see if we can find any evidence of malicious content taking place. I will pause before we hop to our next use case here. And I'm just going to say that pivoting through JA3 hashes is actually a really, really solid approach to identifying particular malicious strings. You can also use it for fantastic environment profiling as well. And my challenge to those of you in the audience here today, and those of you watching the recorded version, is think of ways that you could potentially get insight into what encrypted traffic in your environment looks like. Should everyone be using the same browser set? If my approved browser throughout the environment is, let's say, Firefox, for example, I would expect all my Firefoxes to look the same when they're saying hello. What if I can find a deviation inside of the environment? What if I can find a client hello or a JA3 hash that ties back to known Python libraries, that ties back to known Go libraries? There is a whole collection of JA3 hashes out there, which I'll provide a link to before this webcast is over here, but there's a whole collection of JA3 hashes out there that we can use for lookups to prove both legitimate and questionable traffic as well. That's use case number one. Let's hop to our next one, use case number two. Now, this is another argument that I get into quite often with a lot of organizations that I work with as well. We have no way to gain insight or knowledge of any SSH traffic. Look, I'll be honest with you all, I SSH tons and tons and tons of times throughout the day. I kind of like knowing that I'm inside of a protected space. But when I got to go and analyze that SSH data, I need something to my advantage. So 2 taps away, and we'll see that we're actually, in this case right here, confirmed that we are looking at SSH data. Now, this one line may be a little tough to read on the screen. We can zoom in, or zoom in if you need to. However, I hope you're noticing the particular command line that I've put together there. This is actually Zeek's SSH log. And Zeek has a log which is SSH aware. And believe it or not, as you're looking through this, you may notice that to the right-hand side of this screenshot, do me a favor, give me 2 more taps really quick, John. You may notice to the right-hand side, one more, sir, sorry. You may notice that there is actually a couple of hashes contained inside of this box here. This is another hashing algorithm that has been brought to us by the folks at Salesforce. But again, what it's doing is it's giving us amazing insight into some of this encrypted traffic. So let's go ahead and hit one more tap, and that's going to bring up some of our metadata as to what we're looking here. This is actually a network fingerprinting standard called hash, obviously with 2 H's, which is kind of a little bit of a play on SSH. The nice thing about this here is that the hash algorithm gives us, and by the way, as you're looking through this here, there's actually 2 hash algorithms located inside of this. The left-hand one, the one starting with 6E32, is the hash of my client. And that is actually the specific algorithms that are supported by the SSH client. The right-hand side, the 5EF667, is actually the SSH server hash. So once again, I've just got a really useful sort point here. I've got that network fingerprint that can give me the ability to look for anomalous hashes inside of my environment. SSH hashes, I can look for custom libraries. I can look for output activity. I can look for frequencies of hash. I can potentially detect network exfiltration. On the server side, because I don't really have much insight into what servers are doing, I have the ability to grab a static piece of that particular server, which is that hash. And the nice thing about this here is when my attackers enter the world of what I call volatile network indicators, such as an IP address or a URL, something that can easily be changed, they'll change IP addresses no problem. But what they'll have a tough time changing is that back end that they've set up and spent time developing and spent time working through. So I've just got one slide for SSH traffic, but I'm hoping some of you that are kind of ignoring or putting SSH to the side, all of a sudden just gained, wait a second, I've got a really valuable piece of metadata I can examine here. Let's take a look at our next use case, number 3. This next use case is actually hunting through for malicious indicators. I've once again given us a truncated copy of our con log. And what I wanted to focus in on, and one more tap from you, John, just so I can get this brought into focus here. What I wanted to focus on is really just the proliferation of traffic. If you take a look at the timestamp over to the left-hand side, you'll see that I'm really looking here at about 1.5 minutes worth of activity. But during that time, I've got a lot of SSL connectivity taking place in this case. I've got a lot of SSL connectivity to a multitude of IPs in this place. Now, again, I didn't start out here saying this was malicious aside from the text at the top. What I want to do is I actually want to hunt for something that may be suspicious in this case. So let's hop from our con log to the next slide, which is our SSL log. And that SSL log, and all I did was a little bit of command line slicing and dicing here. Do me a favor, give me 4 taps really quick, John. And what that's going to do is that's going to help our viewers actually summarize some of this data. And what you've got in this particular situation here is a unique count of my JA3 hashes of these particular systems. And in this case right here, I've got 98 different connections, all of which are reaching out to that same JA3 hash of 10EE8D30. But take a look at the left-hand side. Watch that JA3 hash hop between different IP ranges and hop between different IP addresses. Depending on what those ranges may equal to, this gives me something else to dig on. This gives me another piece of metadata to include in as part of my analysis. You can see the same exact thing happen with the BD0BF JA3 hash. Now, again, on the surface, I'm not aware of what this traffic is necessarily doing. What I know is I've got something encrypted that I don't have any full packet insight into. But I know that from a metadata perspective, I've got what appears to be a lot of certificate, or I should say actually JA3 hash hopping from system to system to system. Now remember, JA3 hash is our client hello. So I'm looking at different clients in this case. So let's hop over to the other side and let's bring some of that SSL data into play. So let's go to our next slide really quick, John. And what I'm going to do here is bring in that same exact count that we had before, and 2 quick taps for me, sir. And that's going to bring us into the various SSL related information. And what I've done here is I've taken those various JA3 details and I've combined them with the issuers of these particular certificates. So I'm now looking at 2 different sides of that particular equation. I'm looking at, again, my JA3 client hello, and I'm looking at my various certificate information as it's coming back here. This particular finding here is going to parlay into our next use case, which we're going to see not yet in just a moment here. But again, from a encrypted traffic analysis perspective, I've now got what feels like to me like the best of both worlds, because I have the ability to latch on to these metadata points from my various clients. I can also grab certificate details from my various servers and start to line these things up. Now, some of you are probably looking through these here and you're saying, I don't really see any malware inside of these things. What I see is communications out to Microsoft certs and DigiCerts and GoDaddy and Google and so on and so forth. I don't disagree with you. On the surface, these look like potentially legitimate signed certs, maybe. But again, I'm going through only a couple of pivoting data points here. What if I can take these and combine them with with Zeek alerts? I can combine these with some sort of malicious traffic indicators. Now, and I'm kind of extending this analysis a little bit beyond just what's on the screen here, but I'm now extending this analysis into if I can couple this with known compromised, known threat intelligence, known built-in indicators, or known data enrichment, I now have examples of metadata that Zeek extracts from me automatically that I may not be able to get elsewhere. So my big takeaway for you all from use case number 3 is, and I'm going to leave you here at JA3 hashes and issuers, because I want you to think about the additional data points that you'd want to combine this information with. Do I care about who's calling out to these? One thing we've ignored here has been source host versus destination. Destination, we took out it a little bit. We went through those different lists of IPs, but how many sources are reaching out to this? Is it one host? Is it multiple? What are those hosts doing? What are those hosts known for? Should those hosts be reaching outbound? So the big takeaway here is your network analysis doesn't necessarily change just because the traffic's encrypted. The metadata that you bring to the situation does change. Sometimes it can make you a little bit more powerful. It can give you another set of anomalies to look for as well. Let's hop over to our next use case, John, where I'm actually going to bring this home with actually using this information to your advantage here. So in this case right here, I've got another combination of traffic, and this is just a really quick capture that I did where once again, I'm focused in on pivoting through that SSL activity. Do me a favor, give me 2 taps really quick, John, and what that's going to do is that's going to bring me from the con log into the SSL log. And once again, I've skipped past a lot of the other details. I've skipped past the JA3 hash, and what I've done is I've immediately gone to the destination, aka the server IP, and the certificate information. Now, I'm a big fan of encryption, don't get me wrong. As Greg said earlier on, it's a massive benefit for us to have this type of insight and to have this type of protection. But the one thing that I will say about encryption, which is a fantastic valid pivot point for all of us, is in the wake of it becoming easier and easier to be encrypted, it's also become easier and easier for attackers to pick up encryption as well. And sometimes, depending on the volume of traffic inside of the environment, I'll sometimes work a pivot through some of these various, and I don't want to say untrusted necessarily, because I'm a user of Let's Encrypt myself. But what I do want to look out for is low reputation certificates, low reputation issuers, companies that I may have never heard of. We want to pivot through some of those other details, such as the OUs and the organizational names that I may just not recognize whatsoever. There was a very, very recent article that talked about a various organization trying to get themselves added as a certificate authority. So another takeaway here is as I'm going through and hunting for some suspicious traffic, I want to come back and take a look through hosts and take a look through certificates as well. One more bump thing, I think John is going to give us a point which is going to tie some of this stuff together, and that's really going to conclude and bring together, bring our use cases home. So before I hand it back over to John, who's going to talk a little bit about Corelight's capabilities, and looks like we might have some time available for some Q&A, I wanted to leave you all at the end of these 4 use cases with really some high-level takeaways. And I've tried to go specific for each one, but here's my overall takeaways from all this. Number 1, I gave you just a little bit of a preview of what you can do with encrypted traffic in your environment whilst the traffic is still encrypted. You can pivot through hashes such as JA3 hash and the hash. That gives you a handle on SSH and SSL or TLS established connectivity. You can also pivot through server-based hashes. One hash I did not go through in here, because I want to make sure you do your homework, obviously, is the JA3S, which is the JA3 hash of the server reply. And that actually allows you to view the hash of a client hello and a server reply together, and gives you, again, looking insight into attackers navigating through and changing their infrastructure. Remember, hash, HASSH, gives you insight into SSH connectivity and various supported algorithms. We also talked about using digital certificates and using encrypted traffic certificates as fantastic hunting points. Look at your network traffic and see what your traffic normally looks like, baseline it. Who would I expect to be connecting to? Who would I not expect to be connecting to? And use those pivot points and those anomalies to your advantage. So in short answer, the title of this presentation brings us back to, and again, I'm gonna hand it over to John in just a moment here, but the title of this presentation really centers around not letting encrypted traffic be something that goes away, goes by the wayside, or gets completely forgotten. John, back over to you to kind of bring this home for us.
Matt, thanks so much. That was awesome. Could really hear the excitement in your voice as you're hunting through there. Just because they've gone dark in some stream doesn't mean they've gone dark. It's very clear from your analysis there. I'll just talk briefly about what it is that we, Corelight, do. So I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Corelight, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. We've already got some questions here. So Corelight, who are we? We're a company that makes Zeek easy to use, enterprise grade, and we actually expand some of its capabilities and make it even more powerful than it already is. So, you may not be familiar with open source Zeek before today's webcast, or you may have already deployed a single sensor or a cluster of open source Zeek sensors in your own environment. Either way, Corelight has something to offer you. So for the open source enthusiasts who've already kind of rolled their own open source Zeek sensors in the wild and are using it and loving it today, Corelight really makes it simple to use and highly performant and enterprise grade. So we've done a lot of work, made the perfect marriage of software and hardware tweaks in our appliance line to get top of the line, top of market performance out of our sensors. So we're talking about performance that's up to 10 times faster than what you're going to be able to achieve in the open source world. And unfortunately, we have this unfair limitation, which is Corelight was founded by the inventor and core open source contributors of Zeek, Vern Paxson, Robin Summer, and Seth Hall, as well as a number of other key open source developers who now work for Corelight, including some who just full-time focus on open source development. Long story short is, nobody really knows Zeek better than those developers. And so they've gone to great pains and lengths to get those kind of performance numbers out of our products. And so you're really getting a huge boost if you're an open source shop when you come to Corelight, far less hardware with far more power. We've also given you guys a great GUI. So Corelight's built a web app that makes configuration and management really easy to do. In the open source world, you're otherwise going to be in a command line interface, which can be fun sometimes, but isn't always the easiest way to manage your sensors and manage your software. We've also pre-baked a lot of integrations that organizations want in their environment. So, popular SIMs like Splunk or Elastic, it's very easy to get the data out of Corelight sensors into Splunk or Elastic. Now, for those of you that are hearing this that aren't familiar with open source and you're wondering why some of these things matter, and they sound kind of like table stakes in some case of an enterprise product, rest assured, those things are quite challenging to set up and do in the open source world. And that's exactly where the value of this comes in, is we just make it dead simple to deploy. So in open source land, if you're looking to scale up Zeek in a large environment with high network throughput, you're talking about weeks, months, even years in some cases of fine-grained tuning, management, full-time engineering dedication to those open source clusters, which in some cases is fine. People want to do that. They love to do that. They have the knowledge and the budget and the bandwidth to do that. But in many cases, they don't. And that's, in many cases, Corelight customers have been in that position where they came to us and said, you know what, we don't want to manage these open source clusters anymore. We would rather reallocate the bandwidth of those humans, those high value analysts, to actually using the data and doing the threat hunting and the analysis like Matt showed you in those previous slides. So again, Corelight is the way to really easily get Zeek up and running in your environment at scale. And one last thing I'll mention is packages, so scripting. The JA3 script that we've talked about a lot during this webcast, open source. You can download it off GitHub, use it, install it yourself via the Bro package manager, or Zeek, I did it myself, the Zeek package manager. If you're in an open source deployment, one of the things Corelight does to make open source Zeek even easier to use is we've actually pre-baked a number of high value Zeek packages into our sensors, and we vetted them for performance and security to make sure that they're not going to interfere with the box or expose you to risk. JA3 is one of those scripts. It's such a high value script that we recognized early on when we were kind of creating our short list of scripts for our core collection of packages, that was clearly going to be one of them. So with Corelight, you can simply enable it with a radio toggle on button in your Corelight console. In the open source world, a few more steps, but you can easily use the JA3 script yourself with open source Zeek if you prefer. And of course, lastly, support. You get to pick up the phone and we'll answer, and you get to talk to those Zeek experts who built these products, many of whom have contributed to the open source project in very significant ways, up to and including Vern himself, I think, has jumped in on a support ticket before. So we give you that peace of mind so you can actually use, instrument, and leverage the data and insight that Zeek is capable of generating. And we've got a great and growing customer base, globally distributed customer base. These are just a couple samples of Corelight customers and what they had to say. Large multinational energy company. I remember them in particular because they got great value right out of their POC. He was super happy. He'd plug that in because a particular incident came up around SMB file access, which he was able to answer for his boss in a matter of minutes, doing quick, fast pivots through the logs, much like Matt showed you. He said without Zeek data, he's not sure he would have been able to answer that question. He would have spent hours or days going through Microsoft logs trying to pinpoint, correlate, and answer that question for his boss. So he was super thrilled. A law firm, speaking to what I mentioned about us taking care of it for you, Corelight takes care of it for us and has given us more bandwidth to threat hunt. So they were a global organization, but with a relatively small security team, which many organizations have. Relative to other IT departments, it's, you constantly have more work than you can do in the security organization. They were really appreciative because it unlocked that human analyst bandwidth so they could go proactively look for threats in their environment. With that, let's go to Q&A, and I'll just make one more note here, which is if you are interested in learning more about Corelight, you can visit us at corelight.com, or if you have a sales question you'd actually like to set up and see a demo or get more information about our product, just hit us up, info@corelight.com. We'll have a person follow up with you pretty quickly, and we can provide you much more information about our product line. But I put the contact information up there on the screen for our today's speakers, Matt and Greg. Guys, thanks so much. I think this was a hugely valuable piece of education for the market. I hear this a lot when I'm out there talking to customers about, they hear what Zeek can do, and kind of one of the first questions on their mind is, well, what about encrypted traffic? And it's a challenge we're all dealing with. It doesn't just affect network security monitoring, it affects the whole suite of network security tools in your environments, from firewalls to IDS to IPS. Your whole way of doing network security is going to have to adjust in a highly encrypted world. But as you saw today, it's, don't throw in the towel. There is a ton, and in some cases, there's more ground that you can take back from encrypted, traffic streams rather, with encryption, because they do give you extra ground to hunt on. So we've got a couple questions here. If you have any, let's see, we've got about 9 minutes left. We'll try to get through most of them, but you can also ask questions there in the question panel. First question, let's go to this question, quick question. Is there a GitHub link for the hash script? Yes, Matt, maybe you can provide some more specificity there.
Yep, sure. No, I'll actually get it sent out. So earlier on in this webcast, everyone, we did have Carol send out the link to Richard Baitlick's blog post. I will ask her to send out the link for JA3 as well as the hash in just a moment as well. So whoever asked, keep your eyes on the chat window. They're coming your way.
Awesome. We got another question here. How do you see encryption and traffic insights working in cloud deployments? Greg, maybe do you have any comment there?
Yeah. Well, I'll start by saying that's an area of strategic focus for our company. I don't want to talk maybe too much about it, but I guess that makes us like every other company at the moment. Networks still exist in the cloud, contrary to popular mythology, I guess. They still have the same properties. It's someone else's network, but they still have the kind of ground truth property. We have struggled to get analogs for on-prem taps in the cloud, but I think that's beginning to change. Some announcements have been made, and it's something I've personally been asking for this job and the prior job, back going 4 jobs. I've been asking major cloud providers to provide essentially elastic tap-like services. And I think that may be in the future. Of course, architectures vary in the cloud too, and the need for visibility remains, but the applications and the sort of engineering of visibility will change. I actually think Zeek is a terrific tool for the cloud. It's going to thrive in the cloud in part because of a feature we haven't really talked about very much, which is it's really built for integration in mind. So under the hood, it's just a real-time event processing engine that happens to focus mostly on network traffic, but it's got the ability to ingest logs, it's got the ability to analyze files, it's got the ability to ingest host information. And when you think about all the API streams and data streams that are available to you in a cloud environment, they're just crying out for integration with network-derived data. And so I think that gives you a little window, I guess, into the way I'm thinking about the applications of Zeek in the cloud. But we're all trying to figure this out: visibility, security, and Zeek itself in the cloud. Matt, and actually, if you have ideas or thoughts, I'd love to hear them. Matt, over to you for maybe a different perspective.
Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly with everything you said, Greg. I actually don't have much to add to that. The only thing that I will kind of put from a cloud perspective, everyone, is one of the battles that you're dealing with is that someone does obviously contain kind of the back end of your infrastructure, if you will, because there are parts that you're not managing. But remember, there are pieces of the system that are still yours as well. So with regard to the overall question of visibility, if your visibility needs are kind of system by system based, you may still have some options kind of in the traditional way we've done things in the form of just capturing traffic. If you're looking to get that overall kind of back end view of everything, then Greg, I'm in the same boat as you. We hope that integration comes there soon.
All right, next question here. Do you ever think it's worth capturing full PCAP of encrypted data? Matt, maybe you can take that one.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. So along those lines, if anything, I think we just proved that you can get a lot of value out of having some of that information and having some of those details. And in all fairness, what I do hear in some situations is I do hear kind of this trade-off where, well, there's no use in having the traffic anyways, so you might as well just catch something along the lines of NetFlow. And there's no point in trying to examine any part of this traffic whatsoever. I think we just kind of proved that wrong, number one. Number two, I'm going to kind of, echo the same sentiment I had from before, which is just because the traffic changes doesn't mean you have to give up any part of the analysis that you can do. So whilst it may be somewhat of a weird, contentious thing to think about, is maybe we don't capture all of our encrypted traffic, but we make sure we capture the metadata of our encrypted traffic, because that's really our pivot point. And I don't mean metadata as IPs and flow counts. I mean certificate details, I mean SSL, SSH, I mean hashes, I mean all the relevant information that still gives me a tangible profile of that. So I think it's actually a happy medium that we've got to strike between capturing the right metadata and then obviously having the traffic that matters as well.
Great, thanks, Matt. We've got a couple more minutes here, time for a few more questions. Here's one. I like the context that we can get from encrypted traffic with Zeek. However, if I control the assets, certificates, and keys, does Zeek provide does Zeek have decryption capabilities? How does that affect logging? Greg?
Sure, good question. Zeek doesn't natively provide decryption capabilities. Often people who have the things that you mentioned and have the the policy and legal justification for analyzing decrypted traffic use other tools to terminate encryption. You use packet brokers or middle boxes to gain the visibility they need. Having said that, it's an open source tool, and I certainly don't know how it's been modified and deployed around the world, but natively it doesn't have that capability that you asked for. How does that affect logging? Well, the logs look very different, and you could go to zeek.org to look at, for instance, the HTTP log, SMTP log, and protocol logs normally associated with, protocols that are normally unencrypted or sometimes unencrypted, and you can look at the additional metadata that can be extracted. And so there is quite a difference. We really framed this webinar around the other side of the coin, but I don't know if you have anything to add, Matt, on that topic.
I don't. No, I agree with you 100%. It sounds like the individual who asked that question, it sounds like you're looking for an answer that actually may exist in a combination of a couple different things. So nope, I'm right there with you.
Great. Let's see here. Are there any other data points that can be used for encrypted traffic analysis in addition to Zeek? Matt, maybe you've got some thoughts there?
Yes, yeah. So, in fact, I'll use the examples we just walked through as kind of a representation of that. For those of you, those of you who may have used Zeek before, you may have noticed that as I walked through some of these examples earlier, the only log that I really touched that was kind of a non-encryption log, for lack of a better term, was really the con log. And that was just to serve as like a starting point where I could identify a service. Some of the other like Zeek data that I did not include in there was the DNS log. Because obviously all of this connectivity, well, it's not just IP based. I'm going to have host names associated with it. So that's another pivot point that I can use to the advantage. There is also, and I'm going to point those who asked that question towards Richard's blog, which we tweeted out a little bit earlier. The other log that I left alone was actually the Zeek's X509 log, which actually pulls even more certificate details. I tried to keep some of our use cases, some of our analysis here, very kind of scalable, enterprise-wide, quick anomaly finding. But if I came across a piece of 100% confirmed malicious traffic, there is a boatload more data inside of just Zeek logs alone that I could layer on top of all these, use your points of correlation, and bring together really the picture of that overall communication.
Thanks, Matt. We are at time now. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all the questions, but we will try to follow up with you afterwards. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you found this as educational as I did. And Greg and Matt, thank you as well for giving us your time and expertise on these topics.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Sure thing. Thanks, folks.
All right, and thank all of you, Matt, Greg, and John, for your great presentation, and to Corelight for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.